the people who are going to process my invoices, my acceptance and invoices. So they're a separate customer. And then if Congress decides to look at my particular program, then I've got congressional inquiries I have to answer to. So my customer base is much broader in the government space, and each one of them have very different needs. So for example, if you start talking to the program manager about funds, they're going to say, talk to the contracting officer to make sure enough money has been appropriated for this need, right? Because everybody has a very clear swim lane that they operate within. There are different processes between and within agencies. So my first scary concept of government contracting was working, when I first got out of college, they sent me to work on the Social Security Administration contract that EBS had with them. And Social Security had 8 different major functional areas. And if you know anything about IT, there's a functional requirement stage, a design, development, testing, implementation, and then maintenance, right? So a very structured life cycle. And all of those programs, all those 8 functional areas, were going through all those different cycles. Well, the government was actually hiring companies for one of those functional areas where they were disbarring the same company because they weren't performing in another functional area. So what was happening is the people within the same agency's contracting shop weren't talking to each other. So you have situations like that, and then you have other situations where, HHS does things totally different than FBI. Some of it's the same. You still have the 1,500-page FAR, but they interpret the requirements different, so they do things slightly different. So you need to sort of be tuned into who your customer is. And just like all of you have new people that have just come to your organization and are still learning the ropes, the government has contracting officers that have just become contracting officers that are still learning the ropes. And just to give you a sense of perspective, I was given an award by the White House for a program I put together to train contracting officers for the government. Because just in the Washington, D.C. area alone, that includes District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia, there is a deficit of 5,000 contracting officers. So the government doesn't have enough contracting officers to buy stuff. And they're trying to, and here's what's even worse. The Federal Acquisition Institute, they're the group that trains all contracting officers for all civilian agencies. They don't do DOD, just all civilian agencies. They didn't even have a contracting officer. And if they didn't have one, you can see how big the problem is, right? So they're trying to get that problem solved. So my point is, you might have a contracting officer who has 20 years and knows everything about contracting, or you may have a brand new contracting officer who doesn't know much, right? So it's kind of the luck of the draw in terms of what contracting officer you get. But that also means you can push back. And you can say, well, the way this was handled with this other agency was this way, and give them suggested language. And a lot of times, they're grateful that you've done their homework for them, and they'll change the requirement to accommodate that. Government contracts require close monitoring. So this is not one of those things where you can sort of get the contract and say, okay, well, that's problem solved, and everything's going to magically work. You really have to stay in close, you have to closely monitor what's going on with it. Because, I'll give you a perfect case in point. We had a 10-year contract. It was $500 million, and we were in year 8. And so, what could possibly go wrong? We had all our subcontractors in place. We'd been doing this. We were successful, yada, yada, yada. And then all of a sudden, I got a call one day, I went to one of my government sites, and I was walking through their data center, and I saw a piece of storage, EMC storage device. And I said to the customer, where'd that come from? He goes, I bought it from your contract. I said, no, you didn't. We don't have that on our contract. And he said, yeah, that's what I got. So come to find out, EMC had gotten a brand new salesperson who came from the commercial side of the house. We see problems rising right from the start. Who decided to go to the government and say, hey, do you need any storage, which was perfectly legitimate. And the customer said, yeah, I do need new storage. I was going to buy umpity squat that's on the contract. And this salesperson, who didn't know any better, said, oh, don't buy that, buy this. And so the EMC person put together the sales document listing what was on the contract, but was going to deliver this over here. Now, what problem do I have as a prime contractor?
You switched to subcontractors.
I've switched a product, so the product that was actually sold to him was not on the contract, which means I failed as the prime contractor. Because the government's not going to go to EMC, they're coming to me. And so, fortunately, we had a great working relationship with them, and we were able to add that product to the contract because it was in the government's best interest. But I was really SOL at that point, because my subcontractor did something that was not on the contract. So even though you have these contracts that go on and you think, okay, we've worked out all the growing pains and the initial issues, this kind of stuff still happens, because people get new people on the contract that don't know government business. And then the length of time to win a government contract. You know, when I first got involved in government contracting 30 years ago, it could take 3 years. No exaggeration. For these really large contracts, they could go on, they could have a life of themselves. The government's gotten a lot better at this. In fact, the GSA uses something called reverse auctioning. You ever heard of that? So everybody familiar with eBay? How does eBay work? Where's my online shopper?
My expertise is
Let's talk to an expert. How does eBay work?
Okay, I have to be honest. I shop a lot on Amazon.
Okay. So how does it work? How does eBay work?
You make bids on products, it has a certain time frame, you have a certain number of days to make bids, so you bid against people around the country, and you bid against the product.
Exactly. So the government takes that concept, so this will make you feel better about your taxpayer dollars. They take that concept and they say, okay, we are going to start auctioning at 2 o'clock for this particular product in this quantity. So at 2 o'clock, you can log in and you can place your bid, whatever bid you want. And then someone else can come in, see what your bid is, and the only requirement is they have to go lower than you. And then they say the bidding will go on till 2:20 or whatever the time is, and whoever is the lowest bidder at that point, they're the ones that win the contract. So that's a very expeditious process, right? The RFP process, because it goes through negotiations, takes longer. But again, the government's still trying to shrink the amount of time it takes to do that as well. Any questions about the differences between prime contract, between the federal and commercial business? Okay. Let's just talk a little bit about the different branches of the government. So the executive branch consists of the president, and the president leads all the executive branches as commander-in-chief. Agencies like NASA, DOD, DHS, anybody that are one of those executive agencies, they can have specific requirements, and they can conduct a source selection process to select a winner, and they can award contracts. Office of Management and Budget, they're the ones that actually fund any of those executive initiatives, and we'll talk a little bit about that process in a second. And then there's another group of Congress that's called Office of Federal Procurement Policy, and they're the ones for that 1,500-page Federal Acquisition Regulation. And that Federal Acquisition Regulation changes all the time. So when you see a FAR requirement, you will see the FAR number, reference number, you will see the FAR section title, and you will see a date. Because the date is the date that it was last updated. And that's the one you have to comply with. We're going to talk about the FAR, and I'm going to give you an easy way to get through it, and so that you can find things easily, but just trust me on that for now. There's also a legislative branch, and they're the ones that use the government money to make sure that the government money is spent appropriately. So this is what Congress does for us. It's the House, it's the Senate, and it's the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. They're the ones that have executive committees that look at the funding requests that come in from the agencies, and they try to match that with what the president's initiatives are, and come up with a budget that we can all live by, or that they can all live by. Obviously not highly successful in recent years, right, to get to that point. And then finally, there's a judicial branch. So this is the group that's all the courts, federal courts, the appeals courts, and they handle any disputes that arise out of government contracting. So you can see that it's all three branches of the government have involvement in federal procurement. So how do the branches work together as one big happy family? Anybody know? So the first thing is that the executive agencies, DHS, DOD, etc., they look across their entire organization and they figure out all their needs. And they figure out how much each of those needs are. How much is it going to cost to do that? And then they submit that at congressional hearings. And the agent budgets are either approved and then they become part of the authorization bill, or they're disapproved and they're not funded. So the government could say, well, this program is funded, but this one isn't. So they can do line item veto. The authorization bill, some things are funded directly, which means it takes a lot to get them unfunded. So how many people think about Social Security as being, people always thought Social Security was going to be there. People always thought food stamps would be there. People always thought that things for children would always be there. But you're starting to see, as the government has this bigger and bigger deficit, right? We're spending way more than we're able to pay back at this point. Anybody ever look at the federal deficit clock? It just keeps going, and it's just incredible. I mean, trillions of dollars, right? And so the government's realizing that they can't keep spending at this rate, so now even entitlement programs are being looked at with scrutiny, right, to determine whether or not they should still exist. So those are the fund directly. And then there's others that are most of the stuff that we're going to be working on, they all get funding through the appropriation bill. So if it's approved in the appropriation bill, it gets funded. If it's not approved in the appropriation bill, it doesn't get funded. So when I said before, you have to have three things. What do you have to have? A need,
money.
money, and what else?
Way to get to you.
Right, a way to contract vehicle to get to you. So in this case, if they don't have the funding, they don't have the funding because it's not in the appropriations bill. You can't sell for them. Then the appropriations bill is introduced into the House and Senate Appropriations Committees for final review. And then they appropriate the funds for any authorized project. And they can either appropriate funds exactly with what the agency came in with. So the agency comes in with $1 million, they can fund it at $1 million. Or they can say, you know what, we don't have enough money to go around, we'll fund you at $800,000. So the program manager's budget is now $800,000. Even though they needed $1 million to run the program, they only get $800,000. In theory, the appropriation bill gets passed by the House and Senate, and in theory, it gets sent to the president for acceptance or veto. I seem to have a problem with these last two steps for the last couple of administrations. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about a specific program. So we have this thing called the Constitution, right? And our founding fathers said, this is what we believe are the governing principles for this country, to protect and defend. So we get these big ideas from the Constitution, and because of these big ideas and the subsequent amendments, various federal agencies have been formed. So we have Department of Homeland Security to protect and defend our borders, right? Because we feel that protecting our borders is going to allow us to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have HHS because we're trying to protect the general welfare. So these big ideas that came forth from the Constitution get interpreted over the years into various federal agencies. If you go to any federal agency website, you know it's a federal government agency website because it ends with .gov, you will see a mission for that particular agency. So, Homeland Security to protect and defend the borders. That's their overarching mission. Then what happens is, now that they know what their overarching mission is that came from the Constitution, then they say, okay, what does it take for us to protect and defend the borders? What do we, DHS, need to protect and defend the borders? And that becomes the specific strategies that are designed to implement those agency missions. And then the strategies get met by specific requirements definition. So what do I need to protect the borders? And how does that flow into a program? And that program has a set of requirements, and those requirements are going to help meet that mission for the agency. Everybody with me? The requirements are then addressed through resource allocation. So when Homeland Security says, okay, I have to protect and defend the borders, am I going to do that with internal people, or am I going to use external people? Where do we get involved? Where do we get involved? Are we internal people or external people? We're external people. So that process is called the make or buy decision. So if they decide to make it, that means they're going to do it internally. We don't get involved. Everything we're going to be talking about in this class is when the government decides to make a buy decision because they're going to buy our products and services. So we're in the buy piece. The only time that there's overlap between the two of them, and I would try to stay away from these contracts at all costs, is something called A76. And what A76 means is that the government has that requirement, and they say, hey, contractor community, feel free to bid on this. But oh, by the way, any government agency, you can bid on it too. So government agency people and outside contractors are bidding on that same requirement. Anybody see any problem with that?
We know who's gonna win.
Anybody know why we know who's going to win? Well, as business owners, do you know how much it costs you to do things? Why do you know that?
Because we have to survive every day.
Right? And you have to cut your costs to be able to be competitive, right? So if I said to you, how much does it cost to approve an expense report, you could tell me how much it costs. And you can do that because we use, in industry, we use a cost accounting system, right? So we have the CEO has the overarching budget, and then each of the regional managers reporting to her has their own individual budgets, and then the people reporting up to all those managers have those individual budgets, and everything is rolled out like that. So that if if you haven't made your numbers, I know exactly where the problem is, and I can address it with him. Quite honestly, when Trump became president, the thing that I thought was going to cause his head to explode is this notion of cost accounting. Because he's coming from a business world just like us. And this is what we do, right? We know exactly whose fault it is, which is why it's very easy to say you're fired, right? Because we know exactly where the problem is. Does the government use cost accounting? No. They use fund accounting. So what is a fund account? It means that certain money gets appropriated, and the government it's not their primary motivation to figure out ways to do it better, faster, and cheaper. Their goal is to meet the mission. And if it costs more money, it costs more money. So it's a very different way of looking at the accounting piece. So you can imagine for somebody who's been in business as long as Trump has been in business, to be thinking in a cost accounting method where you can point specifically to whose fault it is. You can't do that in the federal government. You can't say it's your fault because none of that has been trickled down that you have responsibility for this particular cost center, or you have, it's just not done that way. So very different between commercial and government contracting. As I mentioned, resources can come from internal or external sources, and if it's external, that's when we get involved. So this is where this make or buy decision happens. You know, there are some functions that have